March 11, 1943. Somewhere over the dense, mist-covered jungles of Papua New Guinea, a lone American fighter plane with distinctive twin booms and a fork-shaped tail cut through the clouds. Second Lieutenant Richard Irabong scanned the horizon, his experienced eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the distance. The young Wisconsin farm boy, barely 22 years old, had been patrolling alone when his radio crackled with static before falling silent. Below him stretched an endless carpet of green, punctuated by winding rivers and volcanic peaks that disappeared into the clouds. What happened in the next 17 minutes would become one of the most remarkable air combat engagements of World War II. As his P-38 Lightning emerged from a bank of clouds, Bong suddenly found himself surrounded by 9 Japanese Zero-Solite squadrons of veteran airmen with hundreds of combat hours. The odds were impossible, 9 against 1. The Japanese pilots must have thought their unexpected prey would flee or fall quickly. What Lieutenant Bong saw that day defied 400 years of samurai tradition. For in that moment, when American and Japanese engineering met over the vast Pacific theater, something extraordinary happened. Only one candidate in 70 would complete the 2-year training program. This intense scrutiny produced airmen of extraordinary skill who had dominated the skies over China and Southeast Asia in the opening phases of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Service proudly boasted that a single Zero fighter could engage 3 enemy aircraft with guaranteed success. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zero had become a symbol of Japanese technological prowess and fighting spirit. Lightweight, agile, with exceptional range and climbing ability, the Zero outperformed every Allied fighter it encountered in the early years of the Pacific War. At Pearl Harbor and throughout the Philippines campaign, Japanese pilots had reinforced this myth of invincibility. American pilots flying obsolete P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks suffered devastating losses against the nimble Japanese fighters. Japanese military intelligence, which had carefully studied American culture, concluded that the individualistic Americans lacked the discipline and spiritual resolve necessary for aerial combat. American pilots were dismissed as technically proficient but spiritually deficient. They would break under pressure, flee when outnumbered, and lack the will to die for their emperor. This assessment, repeated in Japanese military academies and in briefings to frontline units, had created a dangerous overconfidence among Japanese airmen. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo continued to reinforce this narrative. Field reports consistently emphasized the superiority of Japanese aircraft and pilots. Even as American industrial might begin to make itself felt across the Pacific in 1942, Japanese military leaders maintained that spirit would overcome material advantage. Official records captured after the war revealed that Japanese pilots were taught that American pilots would flee rather than engage when outnumbered, that they lacked the courage for close-quarters dogfighting, and that they were overly dependent on their technology. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility remained largely intact until mid-1942. American losses in the air were staggering. In the Philippines, of the 159 aircraft available to American forces at the start of the war, virtually none remained operational after 8 weeks of combat. Similar stories played out across the Pacific as the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. The Zero fighter, with its exceptional maneuverability and range of 1,100 miles, dominated the skies. By comparison, early American fighters like the P-39 had an effective combat radius of only 120 miles. Statistical comparisons between the forces were equally sobering. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with 10 aircraft carriers to America's 3 in the Pacific. Japan deployed over 2,000 combat aircraft against fewer than 800 American planes scattered across the vast ocean. More critically, Japan started the war with over 6,000 trained pilots, democratic, innovative, and ultimately industrial. After studying at Superior State Teachers College and taking civilian pilot training, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps in May 1941. Within 8 months, as America entered the war, he earned his wings and commission. His natural aptitude for flying was immediately apparent. One instructor, future Senator Barry Goldwater, noted that Bong was the finest natural pilot I ever met. While Japanese pilots had spent years honing their skills, Lieutenant Richard Bong mastered the complex P-38 Lightning in months. The twin-engine, twin-boom fighter was a technological marvel that represented American engineering at its finest. With a top speed of 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 44,000 feet, and armament consisting of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon concentrated in the nose, the P-38 was a formidable weapon. Most importantly, it could match or exceed the Zero in speed, climb rate, and firepower, though it still couldn't match the Japanese fighter's turning ability at low speeds. The contrast between Bong and his Japanese counterparts could not have been more stark. Japanese naval aviators were products of a rigid system that valued conformity and adherence to doctrine. They flew in precise formations and followed established tactical patterns. Bong, by contrast, displayed the creativity and adaptability that would become hallmarks of American fighter tactics. He developed his own approach to aerial combat, one that emphasized aggressive action, even when outnumbered. By December 1942, Second Lieutenant Bong was assigned to the 39th Fighter Squadron in New Guinea. On December 27th, he scored his first victories, shooting down a Zero and an Oscar over Buna. Japanese pilots who encountered this young American reported something disturbing to their commanders. Rather than employing evasive maneuvers when confronted, Bong had attacked directly, closing to dangerously close range before opening fire. This aggressive style contradicted everything Japanese intelligence had concluded about American pilots. Within 2 weeks, Bong had shot down 5 enemy aircraft, becoming an ace with remarkable speed. His success challenged the fundamental assumptions that had guided Japanese air tactics. Here was an American pilot who sought out combat, who flew with a confidence and aggression that matched or exceeded that of the most experienced Japanese aviators. As 1943 began, Richard Bong's reputation began to grow among both American and Japanese forces. On January 7th, he shot down 2 more Japanese fighters over New Guinea. The next day, he achieved his 5th victory, officially becoming an ace in just 2 weeks of combat operations. This rate of success was unprecedented and began to attract attention not only from American commanders, but from Japanese intelligence officers as well. By February 1943, Lieutenant Bong had joined the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, flying the P-38 Lightning. What made his success particularly noteworthy was not just the number of victories, but the manner in which he achieved them. While Japanese pilots relied on the Zero's exceptional maneuverability in turning fights, Bong developed tactics that emphasized the P-38's strengths: speed, climbing ability, and concentrated firepower. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Bong reported that he would dive at high speed into enemy formations, make a single firing pass, then use the P-38's superior climb rate to position himself for another attack. This boom and zoom tactic negated the Zero's turning advantage while maximizing the Lightning's strengths. More disturbing to Japanese commanders was Bong's willingness to engage when outnumbered, something their intelligence assessments had claimed American pilots would never do. As winter gave way to spring in the South Pacific, Richard Bong's aerial victories continued to accumulate at an alarming rate. On March 11, 1943, came the engagement that would cement his reputation and fundamentally challenge Japanese perceptions of American air power. Flying alone on a reconnaissance mission over the jungle canopy of New Guinea, Bong spotted a formation of 9 Zeros. According to the combat report filed after the mission, Bong did not hesitate. Despite being outnumbered 9-1, he drove his P-38 directly into the Japanese formation. The shock of this aggressive move momentarily scattered the Japanese pilots who had expected the lone American to flee. In the chaos that followed, Bong executed a series of high-speed attacks, using the Lightning's superior diving and climbing abilities to strike and then reposition. Within minutes, 2 Japanese fighters were spiraling toward the jungle below, trailing smoke and flame. A third Zero suffered serious damage before disengaging from the fight. The remaining Japanese pilots, confronted with a scenario that contradicted their training and expectations, broke formation and retreated. It was an outcome that would have been considered impossible in Japanese war games and tactical planning sessions. News of this engagement spread quickly through both American and Japanese forces. For American pilots, it provided a much-needed boost to morale and confirmation that their new tactics and aircraft could overcome the once dominant Zero. For Japanese commanders, it represented a troubling anomaly that demanded explanation. How could a single American pilot defeat multiple experienced Japanese airmen? The psychological impact of this encounter extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese pilots had been indoctrinated to believe in their inherent superiority, a belief reinforced by 2 years of overwhelming success in China and the early Pacific campaigns. Now they faced American pilots who were not only technically proficient, but displayed the same aggressive spirit that the Japanese had claimed as their exclusive domain. As spring turned to summer in 1943, Lieutenant Bong continued to accumulate victories at an astonishing rate. By July, he had been promoted to first lieutenant and was regularly engaging multiple Japanese aircraft simultaneously. On July 26th, in perhaps his most extraordinary feat to date, Bong led 10 P-38s against 20 Japanese fighters over the Markham Valley. In the ensuing battle, Bong personally shot down 4 enemy aircraft, bringing his total to 14. A captured Japanese intelligence assessment from this period revealed the growing concern among Imperial Japanese Navy leadership. The document noted, American pilots in New Guinea area displaying unexpected aggressiveness. Pilot identified as Bong particularly dangerous, attacks regardless of numerical disadvantage. This assessment represented a significant shift from earlier reports that had dismissed American pilots as technically competent but lacking fighting spirit. The Japanese response to Bong and other emerging American aces was telling. Having built their air combat doctrine around the premise of qualitative superiority, they struggled to adapt when confronted with American pilots who matched or exceeded their skill and determination. Japanese training continued to emphasize the traditional strengths of their air tactics rather than developing new approaches to counter the Americans' evolving strategy. By August 1943, Bong had been promoted to captain and assigned as Assistant Operations Officer at 5th Fighter Command Headquarters. This promotion might have removed him from combat, but Bong continued to fly missions, adding to his growing tally of aerial victories. For Japanese pilots in the theater, the name Bong had become synonymous with a new, more dangerous breed of American aviator. What made Richard Bong particularly effective was his unique combination of natural flying ability, tactical intelligence, and calm under pressure. Unlike many fighter pilots who developed flashy, high-risk styles, Bong was methodical and precise. He studied the capabilities of both his aircraft and those of his opponents, developing tactics that maximized his advantages while minimizing exposure to risk. This calculated approach stood in stark contrast to the increasingly desperate tactics employed by Japanese pilots as the war progressed. As American material superiority began to make itself felt across the Pacific, Japanese commanders urged their pilots to display ever greater demonstrations of Yamato Damashi, now a valuable symbol of American air power, nearly 6 times the number available at the war's start. American production and training had overcome every advantage Japan had possessed at the beginning of the conflict. Behind this reversal lay the story of America's industrial miracle. In 1944 alone, American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft of all types, a figure that exceeded Japan's entire wartime production. More impressively, these aircraft incorporated technological improvements that kept them at the cutting edge of aerial performance. The P-38 Lightning that Richard Bong flew so effectively underwent continuous refinement throughout the war, with each new variant offering improved performance. This industrial achievement was matched by an equally impressive training program. The United States graduated nearly 200,000 pilots during World War II, each receiving standardized instruction that emphasized both technical proficiency and tactical flexibility. This massive training effort ensured that for every pilot lost in combat, multiple qualified replacements were available. The contrast with Japan's training program could not have been more dramatic. As the war progressed, fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors forced Japanese training commands to cut flight hours drastically. By 1945, new Japanese pilots were entering combat with as little as 30 hours of flight time, compared to the 350 to 400 hours typical for American pilots. The result was predictably catastrophic, with Japanese units suffering casualty rates that approached 100% for new pilots. For Japanese pilots who had survived the early years of the war, the transformation was bewildering. Veterans who had once dominated the skies over China and the Philippines now found themselves overwhelmed by swarms of American fighters piloted by increasingly skilled aviators. The tactical formations and doctrines that had served them so well in 1941 and 42 proved inadequate against the new American aircraft and tactics. A Japanese naval aviator captured in the Philippines in early 1945 offered this assessment. When war began, we believed one Japanese pilot equal to 3 American pilots. By 1943, we accepted equal terms. By 1944, we knew each American pilot worth 3 Japanese. This stark reversal of the pre-war assumption illustrated how completely American air power had transformed the Pacific conflict. The psychological impact of this reversal extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese pilots had been indoctrinated to believe in their spiritual and tactical superiority. As this belief was systematically dismantled by combat experience, morale collapsed. Captured letters from Japanese airmen in 1944 and 45 reveal a fatalistic acceptance of defeat, with many writing farewell letters to family before their first combat missions. For American pilots like Richard Bong, the later stages of the war offered abundant opportunities for success. The once feared Zero had been surpassed by newer Japanese designs like the Kawanishi N1K Shiden, known to Americans as George, and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Frank, but these aircraft were too few in number and appeared too late to affect the overall balance of power. By January 1945, with his record of 40 victories secure, Major Bong was removed from combat operations and returned to the United States. The man who had done so much to shatter the myth of Japanese air superiority had completed his contribution to the Pacific War. For Japanese intelligence officers attempting to analyze the factors behind their deteriorating air situation, Bong represented a troubling case study, an American pilot who combined technical proficiency with aggressive spirit, the ultimate expression of spirit over material factors. That these attacks achieved only limited success against overwhelming American naval and air forces represented the final failure of Japan's pre-war military doctrine. For the United States, the air war in the Pacific offered valuable lessons that would shape military planning for decades to come. The success of pilots like Richard Bong demonstrated that individual skill and initiative remained vital, even in an age of industrial warfare. At the same time, America's ability to mass-produce both aircraft and trained pilots illustrated the decisive advantage of industrial capacity properly harnessed to military purpose. The tragedy of Richard Bong's story is that he did not live to see the war's conclusion. On August 6, 1945, Bong was killed while testing a P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter in California. His death at age 24 cut short a promising career, but not before he had made an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare. In the aftermath of the war, Japanese aviation experts conducted extensive analyses of their defeat in the air. These studies acknowledged what pilots who had faced Richard Bong already knew, that American aviators had combined technical skill with aggressive tactics to overcome what had once seemed insurmountable advantages in training and experience. More fundamentally, these analyses recognized that Japan's emphasis on spiritual factors had proven inadequate against an opponent who matched their fighting spirit while bringing overwhelming material resources to bear. For American military planners, the success of pilots like Bong validated the massive investment in aviation training and technology. The lesson was clear: quality and quantity were not mutually exclusive goals. With proper organization and resources, the United States had produced not only more aircraft than Japan, but ultimately better aircraft piloted by more skilled aviators. The legacy of Richard Bong's achievement extended far beyond the immediate outcome of the Pacific War. His 40 aerial victories set a standard that has never been equaled by an American pilot. More significantly, his success demonstrated that the democratization of excellence was possible, from his first solo flight over the fields of Wisconsin to his final victory over the Philippines. The combination of technological advantage, tactical innovation, and individual courage, from unpreparedness to dominance, from defensive struggle to offensive victory. His 40 aerial victories stand as testimony not only to his individual skill and courage, but to the larger American achievement in the Pacific War. In less than 4 years, the United States had not only matched but surpassed a Japanese aviation establishment that had spent decades preparing for conflict. This achievement, perhaps more than any other aspect of the Pacific War, demonstrated the full potential of American industrial and human resources when fully mobilized toward a common goal. In the final analysis, what Japanese pilots encountered in Richard Bong was not merely a skilled individual, but a representative of a system that would eventually overwhelm their own. The young man who had watched mail planes fly over his family's farm and dreamed of becoming a pilot had not only realized that dream, but had become the embodiment of American air power at its most effective. His story, from humble beginnings to unprecedented success, mirrored the broader American journey in World War II. The skilled veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, from struggle to supremacy, from underdog to overwhelming force. In that journey lay not only his personal story, but the larger narrative of America's transformation from a nation caught unprepared for war to the dominant military power of the mid-20th century. As historians assess the factors that determined the outcome of World War II in the Pacific, the air war stands as a decisive element. And within that air war, the achievement of pilots like Richard Bong exemplifies how completely American forces overcame their initial disadvantages to achieve comprehensive victory. From outnumbered and outfought in early 1942 to dominant by 1945, American air power completed a transformation unprecedented in military history. The Wisconsin farm boy who became America's greatest ace embodied that transformation. His 40 victories, achieved against some of Japan's most skilled pilots, demonstrated that American aviators could match and exceed the capabilities of opponents with far more experience and, initially, better equipment. In doing so, Richard Bong helped write not only his personal story, but a crucial chapter in the history of American air power, a future in which individual skill remained vital, but was now supplemented by overwhelming industrial capacity and increasingly sophisticated technology. It was a future that would belong to the United States, not only through the remainder of World War II, but for decades to come.